What if some of the healthiest, most nutrient packed vegetables simply vanished from our plates centuries ago? Believe it or not, medieval farmers once grew 15 incredible superfoods that most of us have never even heard of today. These weren't just oddities, they were staples, packed with flavor and nutrition, feeding everyone from peasants to royalty. So, what have we been missing all this time? Let's dig in. First up is skirret, a root vegetable so popular during the Middle Ages that it was practically the carrot's cooler, sweeter cousin. Today, it's almost completely forgotten, but back then it was the ultimate low maintenance crop. Farmers loved it because once you planted skirret, it multiplied underground like a hidden treasure chest. It required almost no attention, almost like having a food savings account. Except instead of interest, you got a bounty of sweet, delicious roots waiting beneath the soil. The flavor is what made skirret legendary. Sweeter than both carrots and parsnips, these slim, white roots had a natural richness that won over even the nobility. Medieval lords and ladies demanded skirret for their palace gardens, making it one of the few vegetables with a genuine royal following. But its true value came during the harshest winters. When other crops failed, skirret kept thriving, quietly feeding hungry families when fields lay barren. Old farming manuals even called it the comfort of the poor man's table. Cooks in the Middle Ages found endless uses for it: roasted, boiled, tossed into stews, or even baked into sweet pies. In fact, before potatoes ever reached Europe, skirret was filling the role we now associate with spuds, the reliable, versatile staple that could carry people through the lean months. So why did we stop eating it? Over time, modern agriculture favored faster growing crops with bulkier yields, leaving skirret to fade quietly into obscurity. While skirret was the dependable workhorse of medieval gardens, another plant from that era had a much wilder personality. Enter Alexander's bold, ambitious green that the Romans first introduced to Britain. Medieval farmers loved it, but this wasn't your typical polite little garden vegetable. Alexander's didn't care about neat rows or staying where it was planted. It grew like it had a mind of its own, thriving on roadsides, cliffs, and anywhere the wind carried its seeds. What made Alexander special was that every single part was edible: stems, leaves, flowers, roots, even seeds. The young shoots were eaten like celery, while its leaves added a unique flavor, somewhere between parsley and celery to soups and stews. The flowers topped salads, and the seeds were ground up as a pepper substitute. It was like nature's all-in-one seasoning kit, delivered by a plant that could grow up to 6 feet tall and attract helpful pollinators with its bright yellow blooms. Yet for all its usefulness, Alexander's slowly vanished from kitchens. By the 1700s, celery had taken its place as Europe's preferred aromatic vegetable, and Alexander's became a forgotten relic, now growing wild along roadsides, overlooked by nearly everyone. Few realize that this weed was once a prized crop, feeding countless households. Next on the list is a plant with a name as noble as its reputation: Good King Henry. Nobody really knows why it earned such a royal title, but in medieval Europe it was everywhere, growing wild in meadows and purposefully planted in carefully tended gardens. If there were ever a contest for the easiest crop to grow, Good King Henry would win by a landslide. It comes back year after year without needing replanting, so reliable it might as well list extreme dependability as its top resume skill. Its nutritional value would still impress any dietitian today. Rich in iron more than spinach and loaded with vitamin C, it was a lifesaver during the spring hungry gap, when food stores ran low and fresh greens were scarce. The versatility of this plant was unmatched. Tender shoots cooked like asparagus, mature leaves used like spinach, and the flower buds steamed like mini broccoli. Medieval kitchens treated it as a true multi-tool, and folk healers valued it too, using the leaves to treat wounds and brewing its roots into gentle medicinal teas. Despite its many uses, good King Henry eventually faded from fields as farming became more commercialized and people turned toward crops that could produce faster profits. Today, most people have no idea it even exists. From leafy greens to strange tasting roots, medieval farmers also grew one of the most peculiar vegetables ever cultivated: salsify. At first glance, it looks like a long, thin, scraggly root nothing special. But cook it the right way, and it delivers a flavor so unusual it earned the nickname the oyster plant. Yes, this vegetable tastes like seafood. For medieval cooks, that made it priceless, especially for religious communities. Monks, bound by strict rules that prohibited meat and fish on fasting days, turned to salsify as a substitute. Monastery records from the 1400s show it was grown deliberately for Lent meals, serving as a convincing stand-in for oysters and other forbidden foods. There were two main types: white and black salsify, both requiring peeling to reveal the tender flesh inside. Beneath that rough, unappealing skin was a delicate gourmet flavor. Its value didn't stop at taste. Salsify thrived in cold weather, staying fresh underground even through freezing temperatures. Families could dig it up throughout the winter, and once harvested, it stored for months, a priceless trait in a world without refrigeration. Yet again, slow growth and unusual looks spelled its doom in the age of modern agriculture, as faster, prettier vegetables took its place. And while salsify hid its appeal behind a plain exterior, another medieval delicacy went in the opposite direction, embracing its weirdness so completely that it earned some rather colorful nicknames. Meet the medlar. At first sight, medlars look like small, rough brown apples with a strange open end that reveals 5 seeds inside. Fresh off the tree, they're rock hard, and so astringent they're basically inedible. But medieval gardeners knew the trick. Medlars had to blet before eating, a process of controlled ripening that borders on rotting. The fruit would sit for weeks, softening and darkening until its flesh transformed into a sweet, cinnamon-like applesauce texture. To modern eyes, that might sound unappealing, but to people living in the 1200s, medlars were a prized dessert fruit. Cookbooks of the era include recipes for medlar tarts, jellies, and even wine. They ripened in late autumn, making them one of the last sources of fresh sweetness before winter. Stored properly after bee-letting, they provided rare, sugary treats deep into the cold months. Of course, modern agriculture had no patience for fruits that needed weeks to become edible. Shoppers wanted picture-perfect produce right away, and the medlar quietly disappeared from markets, remembered mostly for its odd shape and scandalous nicknames whispered by medieval farmers. While medlars demanded time and patience to become edible, the next medieval staple was the complete opposite chickweed. This little plant didn't wait to be invited into gardens. It showed up everywhere, unannounced, and refused to leave. With its delicate white star-shaped flowers and tender green leaves, chickweed was impossible to ignore. Medieval farmers didn't plant it, but they didn't complain when it spread across fields, paths, and even through cracks in garden walls. Why? Because chickweed was a free, year-round source of nutrition. It sprouted in almost any soil, grew in nearly any season above freezing, and produced thousands of seeds per plant, ensuring it would always return. In terms of raw nutrition, chickweed was shockingly rich. Fresh leaves contained about 7 times more vitamin C than the same weight of oranges. At a time when scurvy and nutrient deficiencies were common, this weed was a lifesaver. Both peasants and nobles harvested chickweed. For the poor, it was a dependable green for soups, stews, and fresh salads when nothing else was available. Records even show that noble households valued it during winter months when cultivated greens were scarce. Beyond the dinner plate, it served as medicine. Its cooling properties soothed skin irritations, and chickweed tea was brewed to reduce fevers and inflammation. Over time, however, herbicides and modern farming practices declared war on chickweed. It became labeled a nuisance instead of a resource, effectively erasing it from the human diet despite its nutritional value. While chickweed was unfairly pushed aside, another plant suffered from something else entirely, a name so unfortunate that it practically discouraged people from eating it. Scorzonera. Admit it, it sounds more like a contagious illness than a vegetable. But in the Middle Ages, this black-skinned root was a cherished staple. The name comes from the Italian word scorsone, meaning venomous snake. Early herbalists believed the root could treat snake bites. That claim never held up, but the plant's value as food did. Scorzonera is closely related to black salsify, but with a longer, straighter root and a taste often described as milder and slightly nutty, with hints of asparagus. One of its greatest assets was storage. Harvested in the fall, these roots could be buried in sand in cool cellars and remain fresh until the following summer. In an era before refrigeration, that was nothing short of magical. Monks in particular prized scorzonera, cultivating it in monastery gardens not just for its flavor during fasting periods, but also for its medicinal benefits. Herbal texts from the 1500s recommend scorzonera tea for calming upset stomachs and purifying the blood. Growing it today could still impress your neighbors. Announce, "I'm going out to harvest my scorzonera," and you'll sound like you're either driving an exotic car or casting a medieval spell. Unfortunately, as grocery stores began offering fresh produce year-round, vegetables that relied on their long storage life like scorzonera lost their appeal. If scorzonera was misunderstood because of its name, Welsh onions were misunderstood because of their identity. They aren't from Wales, and they aren't true onions. Instead, they're a hardy, perennial plant that likely arrived in Europe from East Asia around the 1200s through trade routes. For medieval farmers, they were a godsend, producing fresh greens year after year without needing to be replanted. Each plant multiplied naturally, forming clumps that could be divided. One gardening text from the Middle Ages even claimed a single Welsh onion plant could feed a family for a decade if properly divided and maintained. The green shoots, hollow like chives, were snipped and added to soups, stews, and salads, offering a steady supply of flavor and vitamins. Their true superpower, though, was winter survival. In many parts of Europe, Welsh onions stayed green through all but the harshest winters. For families living through the cold, hungry months, those little green shoots were a lifeline, delivering fresh nutrition when nearly everything else had withered away. Modern agriculture, however, preferred true onions for their larger bulbs, and the reliable, leafy Welsh onion fell out of favor, becoming a curiosity rather than a kitchen staple. While Welsh onions were intentionally grown, the next plant thrived by simply showing up. Known as fat hen, this wild green wasn't carefully cultivated but was too valuable to ignore. It popped up everywhere, fields, gardens, roadsides, and medieval people, instead of discarding it as a weed, harvested it as a vital food source. Why the odd name? Fat hen was beloved as chicken feed, since hens that ate it grew plumper and produced more eggs. But people soon realized it wasn't just for poultry. Fat hen was a nutritional powerhouse. Modern studies reveal it contains more protein than cabbage, more iron than spinach, and more calcium than kale. If medieval nutritionists had existed, they might have put it on a pedestal as a true superfood. Archaeologists have uncovered countless fat hen seeds in medieval waste pits, evidence that it was commonly eaten during famines. Its leaves were boiled like spinach, tossed in salads, and its seeds could even be ground into flour during hard times. For many peasants, it was the difference between survival and starvation when crops failed. Despite its life-saving role, modern agriculture labeled fat hen a weed, treating it as competition for real crops. By pushing it out, we essentially removed a nutrient-rich plant from our diets, not because it wasn't useful, but because it didn't fit into neat farming categories. While fat hen fought for recognition, Another medieval favorite lovage faced a different fate. Unlike the other overlooked greens, lovage wasn't ignored or dismissed as a weed. It was, in fact, a culinary superstar, widely planted and highly valued. So why don't we use it anymore? Lovage traces its roots back to Roman soldiers who carried seeds as they expanded across Europe, planting it wherever they settled. By the Middle Ages, every monastery garden had lovage. Its flavor is intense, a bold mix of celery and parsley, only far stronger. Think of it as celery's much more confident, muscular cousin. One sprig could flavor an entire pot of soup, saving precious ingredients. Dried leaves seasoned meats. The seeds were crushed into breads, and even the roots were boiled and eaten like parsnips. Medieval candy makers found creative uses too, turning the hollow stems into candied treats. But lovage wasn't just a culinary giant. It had impressive medicinal properties. Monastery records describe lovage tea as a remedy for digestive issues, bloating, and kidney problems. The plant is long-lived up to 20 years and grows over 6 feet tall, producing flavor and healing properties for decades from a single planting. Yet as Europe gained access to exotic spices through trade, lovage's popularity waned. It was slowly replaced by imported seasonings, and eventually people stopped planting it altogether. Today it's a rarity, despite being one of the most useful herbs ever cultivated. While lovage disappeared because it was overshadowed by new exotic spices, another medieval green faded for a simpler reason: confusion. Corn salad, despite the name, has nothing to do with corn. In fact, this mild, nutty-tasting plant got its odd name because it often grew in grain fields, which Europeans referred to as corn long before maize arrived from the Americas. The name stuck, but it confused generations of eaters. Medieval farmers recognized its value right away. Corn salad popped up naturally in autumn after grain harvest and stayed green through the cold months when other greens had vanished. It was like finding a bonus harvest when everything else had died back. Peasants and nobles alike gathered its tender leaves for fresh salads and soups in winter, and its nutritional value would still impress today. It contains 3 times more omega-3 fatty acids than iceberg lettuce, along with notable amounts of iron and vitamin C nutrients that were often scarce during the darkest part of the year. Despite its mild flavor and resilience, corn salad lost ground over time. It wasn't flashy enough for modern agriculture. Farmers preferred lettuce varieties with long shelf lives and uniform shapes, and corn salad quietly slipped out of kitchens, suffering from a name problem and a lack of marketing muscle. If corn salad faded for being too humble, tansy was abandoned for the opposite reason: it was simply too bold. Tansy is a bushy perennial with feathery leaves and bright yellow button-like flowers. Every part of the plant carries a strong, aromatic flavor that medieval cooks adored, but most modern palates can't handle. Its taste was a complex mix of bitter, spicy, and faintly sweet, and chemical analysis shows its leaves contain over 40 distinct flavor compounds. Think of tansy as the rock star of medieval herbs, the one that played at full volume and made the neighbors complain. Medieval recipes used it everywhere, from savory dishes to sweets. A famous Easter tradition was tansy pudding, a dish made by chopping the leaves and mixing them with eggs, cream, breadcrumbs, and sugar, then frying it into a cake. Tansy-flavored cheese was a seasonal favorite, and even ale was brewed with its leaves for special occasions. Beyond its taste, tansy had a practical role. Its strong compounds acted as a natural preservative, helping meats and baked goods last longer in a world without refrigeration. Medicinally, it was valued for treating digestive issues, fevers, and intestinal worms. Monastery gardens almost always included it, often near entrances, since its pungent scent repelled flies and other pests. As time passed, though, tansy's intensity became a liability. As milder herbs like parsley and thyme became more popular, tansy gradually disappeared from kitchens. its powerful personality falling out of fashion. While tansy was too much, another forgotten medieval plant suffered because it was too easy to overlook. Sea kale might be one of the most valuable vegetables Europe ever abandoned. It thrived along the sandy, salty coasts of northern Europe, growing in places where almost no other edible plant could survive. It needed no cultivation and no care, yet provided a steady source of nutrition to fishing communities and coastal villages. Sea kale was harvested two ways. In the spring, its blanched young shoots were cut and eaten like asparagus, tender and mild. Later in the year, its mature leaves were cooked like cabbage, hearty enough to feed whole families. What made sea kale especially vital was its incredible vitamin C content, 6 times more than lemons by weight. For seafarers and coastal dwellers, it was a natural guard against scurvy long before anyone understood what vitamin C was. Its disappearance from our diets makes little sense. Sea kale was, in every way, free food. Yet, as agriculture industrialized, people turned away from wild plants and focused on cultivated crops, letting sea kale fade into the background, surviving mostly as a curiosity for foragers. While sea kale faded due to neglect, the next plant lived a truly double life. Known as woad, it was primarily grown not for eating, but for its ability to produce a deep blue dye. This dye colored everything from soldiers' face paint to the fabric worn by Europe's wealthy. But woad also had a secret role as a food, though only in its earliest growth stages. Young woad leaves, harvested before they developed the strong chemicals needed for dye making, were perfectly edible. They were tossed into spring salads or simmered in soups, with a mild, slightly peppery taste similar to mustard greens. These tender leaves gave families a fresh green option long before other vegetables were available. However, woad's role as a dye crop overshadowed its value as food. The process of extracting the blue pigment was messy and notorious for its smell. Fermenting the leaves produced such an overpowering stench that royal decrees often banned woad processing near palaces and towns. Its edible side was overshadowed by its industrial use, and eventually people stopped considering it part of their diet at all. While woad struggled with its split identity, another humble plant suffered from people overlooking half of its potential. Everyone knows turnips, those starchy roots that filled countless medieval bowls. But what most people today don't realize is that medieval farmers valued the leafy green tops just as highly as the roots, if not more. Turnip greens were the real nutritional prize. They contain 4 times more calcium, 3 times more vitamin A, and twice as much protein as the root itself. Peasants would carefully harvest the outer leaves throughout the growing season without damaging the root below, ensuring a steady supply of fresh greens for soups, stews, and salads. Their slightly peppery flavor brightened otherwise bland winter meals, while the root stored well for months underground. For medieval households, turnips were a complete package root, and greens alike feeding families through the cold seasons. Yet, over time, the greens were forgotten, and the root became the sole focus in kitchens and markets. The leafy tops, once a critical source of vitamins and minerals, were left out of the modern diet, despite being more nutritious than the turnip itself. From skirret to turnip greens, these 15 forgotten vegetables paint a picture of a very different diet than the one we know today. They show us just how resourceful medieval farmers were, and how many nutrient-rich, flavorful foods we've lost simply because they didn't fit the needs of modern farming or consumer preferences. The real question is, why did we let so many of these disappear? In the past, these plants weren't oddities. They were survival tools, culinary staples, and even luxuries. Now, most of us walk past them, or their wild descendants, without even realizing they're edible. Think about how different medieval life was compared to today. Refrigeration didn't exist. Trade networks were limited, and most people lived season to season, relying on whatever the land could produce. That's why these 15 vegetables weren't just quirky historical footnotes. They were survival food, rich in nutrients and designed to thrive where other crops failed. Each had a role to play in keeping families fed and healthy through harsh winters, long fasting periods, and unpredictable harvests. Take skirret, for example, that sweet, slender root that acted as a backup pantry beneath the soil. It didn't just taste good, it could keep people nourished when other vegetables failed. Or Alexander's, the bold plant that practically grew on its own, offering food from root to seed with no fuss. These weren't just vegetables, they were security in uncertain times. And it wasn't just about calories. Many of these plants provided critical nutrients that medieval diets lacked. Good King Henry, with more iron than spinach and a heavy dose of vitamin C, was a lifesaver during the Hungry Gap, when pantries were nearly empty. Chickweed, with its surprising sevenfold vitamin C boost compared to oranges, helped prevent illness when fruit was scarce. Sea kale offered vitamin C in such abundance that it was literally the difference between life and scurvy for fishing communities. Even the stranger ones, like salsify with its oyster-like flavor, weren't just novelties, they filled vital dietary gaps. During Lent, when religious rules restricted meat and fish, salsify allowed monks and devout families to mimic seafood dishes without breaking the rules. It was food, yes, but it was also a culinary workaround in a time when fasting could mean weeks without your usual protein sources. What's striking is how many of these foods doubled as medicine. Lovage soothed digestive troubles and kidney issues while flavoring meals. Scorzonera was brewed into teas to calm the stomach and purify the blood, a medieval catch-all for improving health. Tansy may have been too strong for modern taste buds, but its compounds preserved meats, repelled pests, and were used as remedies for fevers and intestinal worms. These vegetables weren't just filling plates. They were integrated into the holistic survival strategies of medieval households. And yet, almost all of them vanished from our diets. Not because they stopped being useful, but because modern farming and eating habits shifted the rules. Today, speed, shelf life, and visual appeal often matter more than resilience or nutrition. Shoppers prefer bright, uniform produce that looks good immediately, while plants like medlars, which need weeks of patient bleeding to ripen, never stood a chance. Vegetables like scorzonera or black salsify, which grow slowly and look unpolished, were dropped in favor of crops that yield faster and sell better, even if they lack the same storage life or health benefits. We also started discarding bonus foods like turnip greens and fat hen because they didn't fit into the neat categories of modern agriculture. Fat hen, for instance, is a nutritional powerhouse with more protein and minerals than most leafy greens. Yet it's treated as a weed simply because it doesn't come with a price tag or a marketing campaign. The same is true for chickweed, which offered more vitamin C than most citrus yet got wiped out by herbicides. This shift didn't just erase foods, it erased knowledge. Most people today wouldn't recognize these plants if they saw them growing wild. They don't know how to cook them, and in many cases, they don't even know they're edible. Medieval cooks, by contrast, had dozens of ways to prepare each one: roasting, boiling, candying, fermenting, even turning roots into sweet pies or flowers into jellies. These vegetables weren't just sustenance, they were part of the culinary culture. Imagine what it would mean to bring some of these back. Modern chefs are already rediscovering a few, using them to create flavors that almost disappeared from the culinary world. Salsify and scorzonera are making quiet comebacks in high-end kitchens, prized for their unique taste and creamy texture when roasted or pureed. Sea kale and corn salad are being grown by niche farmers catering to restaurants that want something rare but historically authentic. Even lovage is finding new life. Celebrated for its intense flavor in craft soups, artisan breads, and infused oils. But most of these plants remain unknown, even though they're still out there. Alexander's, for instance, still grows wild along many European roadsides, completely ignored despite the fact that every part of it is edible. Chickweed continues to sprout in gardens, more likely to be sprayed than harvested. Sea kale thrives along coasts left untouched while communities import vegetables from thousands of miles away. It's not just about nostalgia or curiosity, it's about variety and resilience. In an age where food systems face new challenges, from climate change to supply chain issues, these forgotten vegetables could offer solutions. Many of them thrive in poor soils, survive freezing winters, and require little human intervention. Good King Henry and Welsh onions can grow for years with minimal care, producing reliable food without constant replanting. Fat hen and chickweed can grow where traditional crops fail, supplying vital nutrients without any cost. Even the plants with quirks, the medlar with its strange ripening process, tansy with its powerful bite, or woad with its stinky dye history offer lessons in patience and adaptability. Medieval farmers weren't just growing these because they had no other options. They grew them because they knew the value of resilience, nutrition, and flavor, even if it meant putting up with odd textures, strong tastes, or long waits. As we look back, it's hard not to wonder how much we've lost by trading variety for convenience. Sure, we have year-round produce now, shipped from across the globe, but much of it lacks the richness, the density of nutrients, and the sheer adaptability that these medieval superfoods once offered. Bringing them back wouldn't just reconnect us to a forgotten chapter of culinary history. It could diversify our diets in ways that make us healthier and more resilient, too. And who knows? Maybe one day, Alexander's and skirret will be back in our markets. Medlar tarts will make a comeback at winter festivals, and lovage will reclaim its throne as the herb that can flavor an entire pot with just one sprig. Until then, these plants remain as echoes of a time when food was tougher, stranger, and in many ways smarter than it is today. If there's one thing these 15 forgotten superfoods show us, it's that medieval farming and cooking weren't just about survival, they were about resourcefulness. These plants didn't survive in fields and gardens for centuries by accident. They were cultivated, gathered, and treasured because they provided something people desperately needed: dependable nutrition, versatility in the kitchen, and a resilience that matched the unpredictable world people lived in. Think about Welsh onions, which produced fresh green shoots through all but the harshest winters, giving families a steady vitamin source when fresh food was almost impossible to find. Or Good King Henry, returning year after year without effort, a dependable leafy green in a time when crops could fail without warning. These were the kinds of plants that quietly anchored diets, even if they never became the stars of feast tables. Even the more eccentric ones had a place. Medlars, with their strange ripening process, might seem unappealing by today's standards, but they provided a rare, sweet treat at a time when sugar was scarce and exotic. Families who had the patience to wait for the fruit to blet could enjoy desserts deep into winter long after most orchards had gone bare. And salsify, with its seafood-like flavor, gave religious communities a way to mimic forbidden foods during strict fasting periods, turning a humble root into a culinary trick. Some, like tansy, were true multitaskers. Beyond flavoring Easter puddings and ales, it worked as a preservative, insect repellent, and herbal medicine. Monks and household healers alike valued it for treating worms, digestive issues, and fevers. Others, like fat hen and chickweed, were lifesavers for peasants. They grew without planting, cost nothing, and offered levels of vitamins and minerals that could prevent illness when crops failed. It's easy to see why these foods slipped away in the march toward modern agriculture. Crops like scorzonera and black salsify grew slowly and looked unappealing, so they were dropped in favor of vegetables that grew faster and sold better. Sea kale and corn salad, which thrived without cultivation, didn't fit into the system of orderly, market-friendly farming. And plants like lovage, which could flavor entire pots with a single sprig, were pushed aside as imported spices became the new culinary trend. But as these foods vanished, So did the knowledge of how to use them. Most people today wouldn't know how to identify Alexanders growing wild by the roadside, let alone turn it into a meal. They wouldn't recognize the tender young shoots of sea kale on a beach, or the clusters of chickweed in their own backyard. Cooking methods that were once second nature, like candying, louvage stems, blending medlars into tarts, or simmering turnip greens in broths, have largely been forgotten. Reviving these vegetables wouldn't just be about novelty or nostalgia, it could bring practical benefits. Many of these plants are naturally hardy, thriving in conditions where modern crops might struggle. Fat hen can grow in poor soil with minimal water, providing protein and minerals without expensive inputs. Good King Henry and Welsh onions are perennials, reducing the labor and resources needed for yearly planting. Sea kale grows in sandy, salty environments, making it ideal for coastal areas where farming is challenging. Reintroducing them could also help diversify diets. Modern produce, while abundant, tends to favor a handful of varieties bred for appearance and transport rather than nutrition. These older plants often pack higher levels of vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. Eating them again could restore nutrients that have quietly disappeared from many plates over the centuries. And then there's flavor. Culinary trends constantly rediscover old ingredients. Just look at how kale, once dismissed as a garnish, became a staple superfood in recent years. Chefs are already rediscovering some of these medieval staples. Restaurants are experimenting with salsify and scorzonera for their subtle, nutty flavors. Lovage is making its way back into soups, infused oils, and breads, thanks to its bold, distinctive taste. Even corn salad, once overlooked, is finding its way onto menus as a delicate winter green. Bringing back these foods also reconnects us to a time when eating was more closely tied to the seasons. Medieval diets shifted constantly depending on what was available, and people had to be patient with their food waiting for medlars to ripen, digging up salsify only when needed, gathering chickweed in the lean months. That patience made the food more meaningful. It wasn't just fuel, it was a reflection of the land and the season. Of course, not every medieval plant is destined to make a full comeback. Tansy's potent, almost overwhelming flavor might never appeal to most modern eaters. Medlars, with their long ripening time, are unlikely to compete with fruits that are ready to eat off the shelf. And woad, with its infamous stench during dye processing, is better remembered for coloring tunics than flavoring soups. But others could easily reclaim their place on our tables. Alexander's, with its celery-like shoots and edible seeds, could be harvested directly from the wild and turned into pestos or stir-fries. Sea kale could offer a local, sustainable source of greens along coastlines. Fat hen and chickweed could be rebranded as free, nutrient-packed salad greens. And lovage, with its intense flavor and medicinal properties, could once again become a kitchen staple for cooks who want something beyond the usual parsley and thyme. What these 15 vegetables ultimately remind us is that our ancestors didn't just eat to survive. They experimented, they adapted, and they found ways to make the most of whatever the earth could offer, even if it looked strange, tasted unusual, or needed extra patience. Somewhere along the line, we traded that ingenuity for convenience and, in the process, lost not just flavors but resilience. Maybe it's time to dig into the past, literally and figuratively, and rediscover what we've been missing. From skirret's sweet, hidden roots to turnip green's overlooked nutrient power, these plants could offer a way to make our diets richer, our farming more adaptable, and our connection to food a little deeper. So, the next time you see chickweed in your yard, or Alexander's along a roadside, or even a bag of lovage seeds online, remember, these were once the superfoods of their time. And maybe, just maybe, they deserve a second chance to grow on our plates.